everyone. Your first flip lesson for spring break is kind of going over what you learned last year about the Cold War and its beginnings. So let's get started with where it starts or who it starts with, and that's going to be with the United States and the Soviet Union. It lasts from about 1945 until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. The main conflict is going to be over our ideas on economy and government. For the United States, we focus on capitalism and democracy. Our ideas on capitalism, which is an economic system where things are owned privately with the goal of making profit, is generally described, and our form of it is described in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations that was written in 1776. He describes basically free market capitalism and laissez-faire economics, which the government keeps its hands off of business, allowing it to grow and flourish as necessary. When it comes to our government, we have a republic, a representative democracy where the people vote for individuals who will represent them in Congress. Now, the flip side of this is going to be communism. For communism, you've learned about this before, where it's an economic system in which the government controls all businesses. There really is no private property. Goods and services are to be shared equally. It is supposed to be a classless society in which there is no rich and there is no poor. However, in the reality of it, pretty much everybody is poor unless you are a high-ranking member of the government. So this starts in 1945, actually, at the Yalta Conference. The United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France decided that after the war was over, World War II, each one would occupy a part of Germany, but then allow for German reunification once the country had been rebuilt and was no longer a threat. However, the Soviet Union was very much focused on dominating the Eastern German zone. They wanted to make sure that Germany paid for what they did, and so they literally were going to require reparations, whereas the rest of us realized that that had been a bad move after World War I. The United States, Great Britain, and France, seeing that we're all democratic countries, decided to actually combine our zones and merge them into just being West Germany. So what you see here with the United States, France, and Great Britain would just become Western Germany, and then this would become Eastern Germany. However, if you notice right here, that is the capital city of Berlin, which was also divided into 4 sections. And then the Democratic side decided to merge theirs into just Western Berlin and then the Soviet Eastern Berlin. But this was a really dangerous thing for Stalin because there was this little oasis of democracy and capitalism in his beautiful sea of communism. There was going to be a long-standing issue there. As World War II was finishing up and we are kind of coming into the post-war world, pro-Soviet governments were being set up in many of those countries that the Soviet Union had helped either liberate or had kind of taken over once Hitler had been kicked out. So you see these start to develop in Poland, in Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. And these become known as satellite nations. And the reason that they are called that is that just like a satellite, although they are independent, they are controlled by an outside force. And this was best described seeing the division between the democratic West and the communist East by former Prime Minister Winston Churchill. And he came out with this speech: "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All of these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. And all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow." He was warning against the fact that the Soviet Union was not just guiding and rebuilding these countries, but was controlling them from the outside as if they were puppet governments, and that there was this massive division between the East and West, almost like an iron curtain. So what do we do about the commies? Well, we get in touch with George Kennan. He is the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union, and we asked him to analyze the situation. Um, excuse me, and he said if the United States could prevent the Soviets from expanding, their system would eventually fall apart. He said that the USSR was actually afraid of the United States and needed to be ensured that they were that the United States would stay out of their business. And if we didn't, then the Soviet Union probably would fall apart. This was all described in what was known as the Long Telegram. It is a telegram that was over 5,000 words long, and it was sent to the US government. And this helps them develop what will become a major part of our foreign policy, which is known as containment. We were looking to keep communism from spreading by using diplomatic, economic, and military force. So the first way that we do this is right after the war is over in 1946, the Soviets were trying to establish communist governments in Greece and Turkey. And so Truman asked Congress for $400 million to help fight against communist aggressions in these areas. And this is known as the Truman Doctrine. And 1 year later, in 1947, we expand this with the Marshall Plan, in which we are looking to prevent communism from spreading all over Europe and helping them recover from the war by giving them economic aid. The Soviets refused to allow U.S. aid to countries that were in Eastern Europe. And so when you look at this map right here, you'll notice that places like the United Kingdom, France, so some of our good friends from during the war are going to get a lot of money to rebuild. But you're going to notice places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary are going to receive nothing. And so because of that, they're going to have a very difficult time in rebuilding after the war, and they're not going to see a lot of progress. Now, going back to the issue of Berlin, there was this little sea of, or this little island of democracy in his beautiful communist sea, and that was really stressful for Stalin. And so in June of 1948, the Soviet Union closed all road access to Berlin, and they closed all airport access. And they were looking to hopefully choke us out of Berlin, basically make the people of Berlin feel like we had abandoned them, and hopefully getting them to turn towards the Soviet Union and say, please, please take us on. However, the United States does like to show people that we can do exactly what they told us we can't do. And so, for 11 months in 1948, President Truman sent cargo planes to drop food and supplies, medicine and toys and all kinds of stuff to the people of Western Berlin. And basically, they just would fly from Western Germany over Berlin, drop these packages from the air, turn right around, and go back to Berlin. And the idea was that it would remind the people of Western Berlin that we did not abandon them and that they should still stick with democracy. And it worked. So as a result of these growing tensions, we create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, which is a pro-democratic military union in Western Europe. This became a major force in trying to protect member nations, democratic nations, as well as countries that might become democratic rather than falling to communism. It originally had 12 countries. Now there's over 26 members from Western Europe and North America. So in response to this, Stalin creates the Warsaw Pact. This was a mutual defense treaty that was amongst the communist states in order to counter NATO. This was also an excuse for reestablishing a harsh dictatorship to ensure that the people of the Warsaw Pact did not try and switch over to NATO or resist against communism. This was not just a political and military alliance like NATO was, but also it was basically an agreement that these satellite nations would allow the Soviet Union to basically run their countries and tell them what to do, with the Soviet Union acting as the leader and the rest of them as basically puppet governments. This whole area and this whole time frame is going to be surrounded by the nuclear arms race. Once we detonated the bomb in 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, suddenly we realized we were in a new world of weaponry. The nuclear arms race is the competition for supremacy in nuclear warfare between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. America had a monopoly of atomic weaponry in 1945, but by 1949, the Soviet Union detonated Joe 1, their first nuclear bomb, which was pretty much an exact replica of Fat Man, which leads us to major fears that there are communist spies in the United States helping the Soviet Union with their nuclear program. This is going to lead to a new foreign policy known as brinkmanship. This is where you are willing to go to the brink of nuclear war to maintain peace, basically threatening to end the world to make sure that nobody does it. This is part of two similar ideas called massive retaliation. In other words, if you blow us up, we will blow you up, and we will blow you up bigger than what you did to us. Another way to describe this is mutually assured destruction. If you come to destroy us, we will destroy you back. Both sides knew that any attack upon the other would be devastating to themselves and thus restrains them from attacking one another. This is going to be expounded by the fact that we have greater technology. For example, we have the B-52 bomber, which could fly across continents and drop nuclear bombs anywhere in the world, as opposed to like the Enola Gay, which was not quite as powerful enough to be able to fly across continents. It had to be relatively close to drop its atomic bomb. We also have submarines that are now nuclear. They are capable of launching nuclear missiles. We have intercontinental ballistic missiles, known as ICBMs. These are basically rockets that allow nuclear bombs to be delivered without the threat of any human life. It is a rocket. It is computer navigated, and so we can just launch it and it'll go and it'll fly on its own. You don't need a B-52 bomber. You don't need any person to drop it off and threaten the life of your own people. And finally, the H-bomb. The hydrogen bomb, the first of which we detonated, known as Ivy Mike in 1952, is thousands of times bigger than what we detonated in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This created a mushroom cloud 100 miles wide and 25 miles high, and it created massive levels of radiation. And so this is going to be the next step in nuclear warfare, is building bigger and badder and meaner bombs. So what is life like living under the bomb? You have this constant threat of nuclear attack. People were terrified that there was going to be an attack at any time. And so we had to prepare ourselves. People started building fallout shelters to protect themselves and their families. These were built in backyards, they were built on school grounds, they were built nearly anywhere that there was a major threat of nuclear attack, specifically the coastlines, the west and east coast. They were stocked with canned food and water. Schools performed air raid drills as part of an effort to prepare children for an attack. And there's even short videos featuring this guy right here, Bert the Turtle, that taught young children how to deal with a nuclear bomb attack. And you'll actually be watching that as part of your discussion questions. So as people start to develop these bomb shelters in their homes, they start to find ways to try and make them more homey, considering that if you did have to go into a shelter, you would probably have to live there for a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks, depending on how close you were to the blast. And so they wanted to make sure that they had enough food, enough water, but also enough of the kind of home feeling items to make them comfortable during this scary time. And so we'll be finishing up with kind of the review stuff in your next lesson, which will be on communism spreading in Asia.